over
of
to me.
Meta.
So, Nish, we wanted to come together in this conversation to talk about one of the core components of our work that is called the archetypal story, the seven principles, or the seven fields. Now, apparently, this is something that you downloaded some time ago. Um, would you please, let's begin actually by answering what happened when that downloaded? When was it? How did it inform you? And what's important about it for you today?
So when I was at university as a university student, I became quite obsessed with the idea that there might be something in common across all the different religious traditions. That's how this started. So I was working on that problem literally for about 7 or 8 years, just reading and studying and thinking, and what what do these religions have in common? And if there is something that's probably quite important. And then I was on an IT conference, which is where all the great discoveries happen, in
Mhm.
1994 at the University of Warwick, which is actually where I studied maths. I was there back there for a university for an IT conference on C++, I think it was. And it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't get to sleep. So I got up, made myself a drink, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, this insight, if you like, came that all these religions are telling a story. They're telling a story about how we've lost something and how we have to find it again. Um, because otherwise, why would the religion be there? That if we're not missing something that the religions can fix, why would they even be there? That they're there essentially to solve a dilemma or a problem of some kind. And then that's how the seven principles kind of appeared as a way of telling this story of how we lose connection with the ultimate reality or the source of all meaning or the source of all happiness or whatever
Mm.
you call it.
Mhm.
How we then want to or need to find our way back again to that source, whatever we want to call that, God or nirvana or Tao or whatever. Um, and then seven very specific points on that story emerged: spirit, self, suffering, hope. Hope is the pivot on which the whole story turns. And then knowledge, salvation, and love. And what I found is that every single tradition that I was studying, about 8 different traditions and about 4 or 5 major teachers as well, all of them tell this story, and it's not incidental. This story that they're telling is core to their entire message, although they tell this story in many different ways. And why it's important to me now is that I've seen that it applies to a lot more than just different religions.
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
fact, far more importantly, as sort of 10, 15, 20 years ago, I learned much more about development. That same story is told at each stage of development, and each individual and each stage of development is telling that same story in a different way.
Mhm.
It's not just their
Mhm.
traditions, but more importantly, it's there in every human life. And it's the
Mhm.
meaning of our lives. Every single one of us is making meaning of our lives through some kind of story, through a lens through which we are seeing some kind of story. And that story has these same contours, these same seven principles in some way. That's what's
Mhm.
so fundamental about it. So, what I want to ask you is, when you first heard me talk about these seven principles at some point, maybe 5 years ago or something, what is it about it that made sense to you that then brought us together to work on this together? What is it that you found so compelling about this?
Mhm. Mhm. So I would say the experience that I had with coming across this material to begin with was realizing the realization that these are that meaning is a container of these things that and that and what really excited me about it was because feeling that now we're in a meaning crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing something, the seven spirit self, suffering, hope, knowledge, salvation, and love as being words that can apply, that everyone will be somewhat familiar with, but they'll all have different interpretations. And so in my needing to want to help us through this time of transition, that the seven fields or principles are ways to make meaning explicit,
Mhm.
and that the extent to which we become conscious of how mostly unconsciously this process is happening in the background, but where in this time there's a higher degree of uncertainty and confusion and ambiguity, that to the extent that we can collapse those things and give something for individuals that is tangible, relatable, understandable, that they can examine and determine what about these things really mean something to me.
Mm.
And from there, it's like a restoration of agency. They become a North Star or an orientation. It's like being on a ship at sea and nobody has a hold of the, what is it called? The steering. But now you can put your hands on it
Mhm.
and start to navigate these choppy waters and
Mhm.
mhm, have
Great.
direction.
Yeah. So I started calling this story the archetypal story
Hmm.
because it's a recurring pattern that you can see across myths, in religions, in literature, and even and most importantly, in human experience. So details differ a huge amount. In other words, we could say the surface structures are very different, but the deep structures are very similar because there's a very similar journey that the protagonist goes through in this story of struggle, a deeper understanding, and then some kind of transformation which resolves the struggle, or at least um, gives meaning to the struggle, at the very least, even if it doesn't resolve it. Um, and generally speaking, it's a story of a movement from limitation and uncertainty,
Hmm.
meaning to wholeness to connection, which is what we all consciously or unconsciously want.
Hmm.
In many different ways that this happens.
Hmm.
Do you want to say anything about that idea of this being an archetypal story? And then we can move on to look at the seven principles one by one.
Hmm. 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 Yeah. Um, I will say that so in a story, there are many elements that come together to make a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to highlight that the proposal is that these seven fields of meaning or seven principles are the elements that make the story. And way I see them in my mind
Mm-hmm.
is that they are interdependent, they cannot be separated, that um, they are moving and sort of bouncing up against each other all
Mm-hmm.
of the time, and that there is uh, a variety of ways that that story can unfold, from it including something that may seem linear,
Mm-hmm.
but also to something that is dynamic. But even going beyond that, more from a spontaneous or what seems spontaneous, but is more about how these uh, aspects are relating to each other and the tension that's being grown between each other and the kind of what may seem like spontaneous change, then they become dynamical in a way. So
Mhm.
there's this kaleidoscopic way that I see these things interrelating with each other.
Mm.
And that there's seeing the fields, but then the expression of them, what you pointed to there in terms of content, and that's where the narrative of the story comes from.
Mm. Yeah, great points. We're not suggesting this is a rigid linear story. These are
Yeah.
just fields that interact and manifest in a whole variety of different ways in a very dynamic, fluid way. And we're just pointing out that these are, in a way, just waves on the ocean.
Mm.
There's many other ways we could have told this story, but we feel this is one very fundamental way to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, shall we leap into doing a quick overview of each of the seven? And then in future conversations, we can come back and look at how these show up in different traditions, in different stages of development, in different contexts, and so on.
Yeah.
So, let me start with the first one. The first one, I've called it spirit, which is a kind of religious mystical term, but it's not restricted to religion or mysticism. It basically just means that which represents the ultimate reality or the true nature of reality or the source of meaning or the source of happiness or the point of it all. It's whatever is conceived by the individual as the ground of everything and also the purpose of everything. It's just that ultimate thing, which is the most ultimately desirable, fundamental element of existence. That's probably one way of putting it. And it's always usually something much greater than ourselves. We can call it God, or we can call it nature, or we can call it reality, or we can call it destiny, whatever. And it's that spirit, which is the generic term, that gives the deeper purpose to life and enables us to feel connected to something much bigger than just our own individual existence. And it's that connection which is the ground and the basis for where any kind of real meaning can come from. So that's where this story begins. So over to you.
I'd like to add that because you're right? The term spirit has a very religious association.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And if this story works, if this is the archetypal story that's always present,
mm-hmm.
then for people who um, would feel triggered or turned off by, or wouldn't call it spirit, another word for that might be energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yes, I like that energy source.
Mm,
Of the universe. But energy is great, yes, because that's moving away from a religious orientation more to a scientific, materialist orientation. It's an important point you bring up because the very words that you use to label these principles, even though this story shows up in many different contexts, and we're suggesting that these principles in some way transcend all these contexts and show up in all of them. When you want to talk about them, you're necessarily in a context. So you
mm-hmm,
can't use language in a context free way. So these
mm-hmm,
principles have taken on these terms because when I first discovered the model, I should say, rather than created it, the context was religious, comparative religion.
mm-hmm,
That's why they've taken on these terms, but they have expanded to mean much, much more than what they originally were meant to mean. So energy is
mm-hmm.
another great a great formulation, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll move on to the second principle, which is the principle of self. Now, this is the individual, what we presume ourselves to be, our identity, the answer to the question, who am I? And most of us, except you and me, of course, but most of us are divided. We're uncertain. We're unaware of who we really are, of our true nature. And in a way, our journey is to discover those hidden aspects of ourselves and to understand who we truly are. That becomes part of our journey. But we have this first principle of spirit, and we have, in the face of that spirit, we have us, the self. And in a way, these are two of the primary elements that inform our entire existence. Another way of framing it, kind of, would be subject and object, although spirit is a lot more than object. But there is self, which is your identity, and there is spirit, which is the much bigger context which makes sense of everything. And in a way, we're suggesting these are the two fundamental elements on which the whole story is based. The story begins with these are the two main characters in the story, self and spirit. We can say, the soul and God, or we can say the organism and its environment, or the human being and energy. There's all different ways of formulating that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who I am and the huge context that grounds or situates who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Over to you, self.
I would just build on that a little bit to say that it is the existence of the self that provides the capacity for the reflection or the recognition of the whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. In other words, spirit and self kind of exist, rise and fall together in some sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's quite a radical point, because a lot of people would assume, well, there's spirit and then there's kind of self, which is far less important. But in some sense, if there was no spirit, there'd be no self. But we're suggesting, in some real sense, if there was no self, there'd be no spirit.
Yeah.
Because it's the self that recognizes.
It would be unaware.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking more poetically, it's the spirit itself becomes aware through the self that is aware of spirit. There is a dynamic of awareness going on between spirit and self. And we can see this expressed in many, 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 many different ways.
Yeah.
We can say, the universe becomes aware of itself through the self. The self is the universe awareness in some sense.
And there's like the material existence becoming aware of the immaterial, of the nothingness, or I'm not sure what the right word is. It's hard to talk about it, but yeah. Mm-hmm. The obvious and the less obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the manifest and the unmanifest, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm.
So those are the two main characters in this story. That's always there in some way. So now we come to the third point, the third principle, which makes the story necessary. And that is that in some sense, and there's many different ways of formulating this, but in some sense, there is a disconnection or a disjunction between self and spirit. The two are not in harmony. The two are not in a sense of, in a relationship of kind of mutual togetherness or whatever. Some kind of disjunction or separation has taken place between self and spirit. And that is the root cause of all the different things that we don't want to experience. Loss, failure, exile, conflict, death. All of these things, either literally or symbolically, are the result of us either literally being or at least perceiving ourselves to be separate from this bigger context in which we arise.
Mm-hmm.
That's another way of putting it. Self, each one of us, we're arising in this much bigger context. And then we
Mm-hmm.
separate ourselves from this bigger context. And that is the root cause of everything that makes us suffer, or at least makes us think we're suffering. We could call it a self-contraction. That's another way of putting it. The self contracts away from the spirit in some sense. And we lose contact, or we lose,
Forget.
we forget. Yeah, absolutely. Either it's a forgetting, or in some cases, it's even a more literal embodied movement away from that bigger context, which creates this sense of an isolated self, which creates suffering.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because we use the word suffering, but again, this is where it's important to realize that um, there's a variety of ways to look at what's happening in at these points in the stories, because the suffering is in it's what makes you aware of your existence and your differentiation in life. And there's something about the like, is it suffering, or is it the foundation for growth?
Mm.
Is it suffering, or is it the mechanism by which the story becomes possible?
So what you've really very well highlighted there are different perspectives on what this third principle is, and
Mm-hmm.
what function it serves. So there are some philosophies like Buddhism, for example, particularly in its earlier formulations, that would see this purely in negative terms. It's just suffering.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of life is to get rid of that suffering. That's it. But I
Mm-hmm.
think there are other later developments. I'm just talking in sort of spiritual traditions now, but there are other, obviously, we can talk about other philosophies and approaches that take a more positive view of this third principle, which is that this separation between spirit and self, it's not simply this unmitigated tragedy that Buddhism maybe as in certainly early Buddhism, but actually it's also a necessary step, a necessary movement in order for
Mm-hmm.
higher to come out of it.
Yeah.
Something bigger and better is going to come out of this seeming suffering. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what
Mm-hmm.
we call suffering, and we'll just call it suffering, but with that caveat, that suffering serves a higher purpose. It's not simply something to fix, but it
Yeah.
serves a higher purpose of growth and development as well. So these are different ways of interpreting what that third principle is.
Yeah. I'm feeling like that there's um there's something about, that happens with the arisal of meaning in this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we could spend a lot of time on all of these, but particularly suffering
Mm-hmm.
there is. And that would be a great conversation to do sometime
Mm-hmm.
to really unpack that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And yes, just to add to that, that it's actually this separation between spirit and self to create what we're calling suffering is the precondition for the arisal of meaning. Meaning, there is no meaning if there's no separation. It's there's no meaning if there's no other.
Yeah.
That separation between spirit and self that causes the arisal of other. But the arisal of other also causes suffering. So suffering and meaning, in a way, are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Meaning and suffering are head and tails of the same coin. And every morning you toss the coin and you get one or the other. But
Yeah.
how's that day going to go for you?
Yeah.
Mm. Mm.
It's
So
really important.
we've laid the foundation of the story. We've got the two main character
Yeah.
dilemma that occurs. Um, But that's not the end. Now in the midst of that separation, in the midst of that suffering, we do glimpse that there is something beyond all of this. There is a way to transform, whether that
Yeah.
is to get rid of the suffering or whether that's to use the suffering for a higher purpose, both of which is actually, for me and you, I think, the far more exciting of the two. And that possibility of transformation is implicit in the face of that suffering. And I would suggest that we're calling that the principle of hope, which is the fourth principle. That is actually, that principle of hope is the pivot on which this whole story rests, because the direction of this story changes now. It's been a kind of a downhill slope, but now we're at the bottom of the hill, and now we're going to start going uphill again. But that fourth principle, that intuition that transformation is possible in the face of suffering, I suggest drives a lot of art, literature, music. That intuition, it comes out in all these different ways. I mean, just listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or look at some of the paintings, some of the later paintings of Van Gogh, or read some of the great literature in, say, the Russian literature, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. You can see this principle of hope that, yes, there is suffering. We're not denying the fact that there is unimaginable suffering in life, but that's not the end of the story, not because suffering can just be blandly eliminated, but because it can be transformed into glory. There's real possibility of growth and meaning in the midst of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, nothing gets this across better than the image of Christ on the cross. You've got God being crucified. In the midst of that, there is hope, whether you believe in it literally or not, but that's the symbol. So there's always a promise, a guide, a vision, a belief that there is still light in the darkness. And it's this principle of hope that is the evolutionary impulse that gives us the motivation to endure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, say some more on that.
Well, the other words that were coming up for me, because you can really feel the energy in the word hope. I mean, there's a trajectory to it, and it does appear to the only, I feel, it's persistence, life persisting. It's existence continuing to exist. And the evolutionary impulse, but there's a real feeling behind it. Yeah.
So, principle number 5, then, what emerges out of this hope is if we want to find meaning, and if we want to take this story to the later stages of this story, one of the things that arises out of this hope, before we can have any kind of real resolution or any kind of real deeper meaning making, we need to understand the territory. So I think the next principle, we've called that the principle of knowledge, because at some point we gain some kind of real insight into this journey. We start to learn truths about ourselves, about other people, about the world that we previously didn't know. And it's not usually intellectual knowledge, but it's knowledge that comes through that experience of suffering and through that experience of hope. If we allow ourselves to move deeply into these experiences, knowledge and insights can come out of that. It's experience and suffering and confrontation with the real brutal reality of what life can be. It's trying to teach you. And this is the beginning of the knowledge of spirit. We've kind of lost spirit.
Right.
And now we're finding our way back to spirit. And the first major step is knowledge of spirit. Before we can be united with spirit or realize spirit, we get some kind of insight into what it is, not through necessarily mystical experience. That's very rare, but just through what life is trying to tell us. It's like life is always trying to move us through this story.
Yes, that's right.
The life has something to teach us, and that's the principle of knowledge.
Yes, totally. And so I want to dip back and say, the self is the instrument through which life or the transcendent or the whole can be recognized, and that there is this tension of the connection and disconnection
Mhm.
that is some of the juice, if you will, or something like that, the mechanisms for the which the story continues to unfold. And
Mhm.
um, but the knowledge, and the possible for recognition, the recognition of the connection to something higher and bigger, that you
Mhm.
are more than your simple self contracted
Mhm.
individual that you think.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Yes. These are glimpses into your true nature. These are glimpses into that bigger context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mystic
Mm-hmm.
experience is an example of this, but even science is an example of this. Art is an example of this. Anything
Mm-hmm.
that enables us to glimpse or experience that thing that is bigger than us that we've lost somehow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I'm loving is about the way that loving about the way this conversation is unfolding is uh, talking about them individually, but then also talking a little bit about how they're interacting
Mhm.
together.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and these are the things that make the story unfold.
Mhm. Yes, yes.
Anyways, fantastic. Great. So, knowledge. Great. What's next?
What's next? So, episode 6 is salvation. Again, a religious term, but it
Yeah.
doesn't have religious connotations. It simply means that we're now reaching a stage in the journey where we're getting some kind of resolution or some kind of deliverance or some kind of understanding or some kind of true
Mhm.
realization of meaning in the midst of that suffering or disconnection that drove this journey in the first place. There's many different ways that it can take. It can be redemption, it can be forgiveness, it can be liberation, it can be reconciliation or
Acceptance.
acceptance, surrender, or most
Hmm.
what's available to almost anybody is the recovery of a sense of purpose.
Hmm.
If that
Hmm.
sense of purpose and meaning was lost,
Hmm.
principle number 6 is where it's found again.
Hmm.
And the simplest way to talk about it, which we do in some of the very early traditions, is it's simply a way of escaping difficulty. But we're suggesting that's just quite a basic way of describing it. There are richer ways of describing it and experiencing it.
Hmm.
Just escaping difficulty. It's more that we literally become something new. We literally
Hmm.
deeper state of wholeness within ourselves and in the way we live.
Hmm.
So what we glimpsed at the principle of knowledge now becomes a permanent state of self-transformation
Right.
at the principle of salvation.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
knowledge in 5 becomes embodied in 6.
Yes. It feels like a new plateau
Yeah, exactly.
from
Yeah,
which the whole thing is going to start over.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Say more about that, how it's all going to start over again.
Well, my the one thing I didn't answer when in the very beginning of this was, I mean, there's the impact of it, but there's how to when I if I hold all of this, the 7 principles, the 7 fields, the archetypal story, if I hold it lightly in my mind and not think too much about the details, but for what unfolds for me in my mind is like how it happens, that this isn't these aren't points.
Mm-hmm.
These
No.
are, like I said in the beginning, right? Interdependent, they are dynamic, they are dynamical, they are moving against each other, and they're pushing and pulling in every moment. And don't forget, right? We're in relationship to everyone else's story too.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
And
absolutely.
so, but there, I think of it as ways that the tension is moving and becoming stronger, and then energy is released or whatever. And there's a new, I called it, like a new foundation or a new understanding, but I'd also say maybe something a little bit more back to being closer to a homeostasis,
Yes, yes. Yeah,
the plateau,
yeah, yeah,
where the tension now is probably less.
yeah.
There's not so much tension. There's more of something equal.
hmm
It feels
So,
calmer to me. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, no, you finish what you were saying.
Yeah, yeah, no, that it feels calmer. Yeah, and coming back to some of the way I was describing the story before. You're out to sea, and it's choppy waters, and the wind is blowing, and now you've taken, um, but at some point those waters calm down,
hmm hmm
and salvation feels like a place where the waters become calm again.
hmm Yes. So what I'm seeing you describing here is a spiral. Really,
Yeah,
there's an imbalance. It forces us to move to a
that's
higher,
right.
higher place of resolution. So
Yeah.
we've gone through the story that works for a while, and then
Mm-hmm.
a higher or deeper form of disjunction or suffering arises, requiring a newer and deeper resolution. So this
Mm-hmm.
archetypal story is constantly at work again and
Yes.
again at deeper and deeper forms of development, which is what we'll come to discuss.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's very different from the kind of pre-modern traditional way this story was told, which was that this is just something that happens once and then you're free or you're enlightened or whatever. But actually, the story keeps
Uh-huh.
again and again in different ways. And
Yes.
this is a crucial insight that I think
Yes.
separates a more postmodern integral understanding from the more pre-modern traditional understanding.
For me, it recontextualizes religion to something that's active.
Yes, yes. And something that morphs along with us as
Yeah.
we transform, religion transforms with us. And dare I say it,
Yeah.
as we transform, God transforms with us.
Mm-hmm.
This is a thing that David Bohm always used to say, that
Mm.
the whole is evolving along with the part.
Yes.
Parts change. We don't just go back to the whole again. We we learn new things, and those new things are introjected back into the whole.
Mm-hmm.
They become part of the bigger field, which then informs future journeys of the part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
God, God, speaking mythologically, God and the human, we are evolving together. God learns from us just as much as we learn from God. We're co-participants in this crazy journey.
I do not want to go too far off topic at all, but I'll just say so. What I'm seeing in this for the first time now is that so in this co-evolution, then this God or spirit or the universe or energy or whatever you want to call it, or the larger field, that it is evolving. And just quickly, that somebody asked me the question yesterday. They said, "Have you heard of the story of a hundred monkeys?" I think that's what they called it. And I said, "No, I've never heard of this story." And they said it's that an observation that there were an island with monkeys on it that started doing something different. They picked up a new tool, they found a new way to do something. And then on a completely separate island, completely disconnected, monkeys on a different island started doing the same thing. And we've seen things like this emerge over time, like, the Abrahamic religions emerging at the same time. And it's so interesting when we reflect back on history to see how certain ideas and stuff, you see, nobody's stealing IP. There's no, most of the time, they're not even aware that the other exists. But
Exactly.
somehow this information is happening. So this is the picture of how maybe field theory and things like that even works.
I think that's exactly right. What you're talking about here really is like Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we see that at every stage of the journey, when blue emerged, suddenly blue religions exploded all over the world. When
Yeah.
orange emerged, suddenly. And we can't explain it simply by the spreading of information. It's happening at a more subtle level than that.
Yeah.
So
There's no, yes.
the whole, what the parts are discovering is being embedded into the whole and then being fed back out again to other parts that can then learn it. If
Yes.
a rat learns to walk through a maze in the UK, rats in China will be able to do it much more quickly than the rats.
Yes.
And this is Sheldrake's.
And I'll just say about the word information in formation. So it's
Yeah,
the subtle coming into form in formation. It's not the literal data or the sharing of papers.
yeah, yeah,
It's something much more
yes.
subtle.
You can even see this in the Bible. I mean, you can see God. I mean, it's probably not really God, but our understanding of God is changing as we move through the story of the Bible. God becomes
Mm-hmm.
more loving and so on and so on. You can see this in
Yeah.
the traditions. So this is so important that this story is not just a one-time story. It's happening again and again at every level, in every context. The whole field of experience is this interconnected network of this archetypal story here, there, and everywhere. And a story over here is informing a story over there.
And so you've said God becomes more loving, which might bring us to our final
The
principle.
final principle, which is that once that salvation or that resolution has taken place, how does it live out in the world? Well, the fullest expression of the archetypal journey we suggest here is love. It's a connection of the individual to other people. It's a breakdown of that isolation and self-centeredness that was at the root of the principle of suffering. It can appear in all kinds of ways: compassion, sacrifice, friendship, family, romantic love, divine love. But the key thing here is that the transformation of the self that was calling us at the principle of hope ultimately finds its fulfillment not in knowledge about the self alone, but in rediscovering what it is to surrender the self to something much bigger than the self. And love is the ultimate expression of that. And that's how it's through that love we heal that disjunction that started this story between spirit and self.
Mm-hmm. Um, there's so many ways that you get into talking about expressions of love and what love
Mm.
is in varying degrees, but thinking about it just purely in relationship to the archetypal story, it feels like that back, well, in suffering,
Mm.
there's emotions or feelings that aren't the same feelings as joy. There's or joy and love, that there's some despair,
Mm. Yeah.
right? So this is a reconnection and a return to love.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so our suggestion is, and we'll continue this in future dialogues, that we'll explore how this story shows up in different traditions and more
Yeah.
importantly, at different stages of human development, both individual
Mm-hmm.
and historical. So we'll really go into the details because we've made a lot of sweeping statements. Now we want to actually give examples, which we can start doing in our next dialogue.
Mm-hmm. And so this is, it's interesting because this is a theory that we continue to test.
Mm-hmm.
And in what you're describing, we'll do in other talks and giving more and more examples of it.
Mm-hmm.
Then those are sort of helping to reinforce the theory. But
Yes.
out of curiosity, just generally, what do you think is the benefit of, like, how can this information, how can an individual, what would be useful to them about diving more into the way that they're making meaning using the seven principles?
So I think there's two answers to that that come to mind for me. One is that when you look around at the fragmented world in which we live,
Mm-hmm.
different belief systems, different worldviews, different ways of being, and so on, there seems to be this huge fragmentation. And what seems to be calling out that we need, especially now in the kind of meaning crisis we're facing now, is some kind of integration of the different ways of being and ways of understanding the world. You okay?
Yeah, hiccup. Sorry.
And this can provide, we suggest, a basis for integration, because to integrate worldviews isn't just to kind of combine them together in some kind of random eclectic fashion, which often is done in the name of integration. What real integration is to find the pattern that connects all of them.
Yeah.
If there's a pattern that's running through all these different fragments, we've integrated the fragments and made them into parts. If and to have that insight that the guy over there who believes something completely different, that I hate what he believes, let's say. If we can find that actually he's living out the same story that I am, just in a different way.
Yeah.
Then that's the basis for integration. So that's one answer. And the second answer is self-understanding. If we can understand the story we are living ourselves, each one of us is living this story in a different way. We can become aware of that rather than make the story conscious, rather than allow the story to run us unconsciously.
Yeah.
We can get some kind of empowerment to create the story we want to create.
Yeah.
We need to become aware of the story first. So this is the first step in becoming aware of the program that's running us. And then we can to become the people we want to be, to live the life we want to live. To some degree, we might be able to do that, but we need to become aware of it first. So those are the two answers I'd give to that.
And another way I'm hearing things is that many individuals, so on an individual level and on a collective level, there is this experience we're having now of a lack of meaning.
Yeah.
But what we're proposing with the archetypal story and the seven principles especially from an origination point, it is to help to disclose the meaning is preeminent. It is imminent. It exists. Meaning is here. Your perception of this moment is that it lacks meaning, but no meaning, it is here. And that through the archetypal story and through the seven principles, you can discover, uncover, become conscious of how you're making meaning. And that restores some agency to put the hands back on the steering
Yes,
and
yes,
navigate to from the choppy waters to the more calm waters.
yes, absolutely. Yes,
That's the potential.
that's the potential which we want to be exploring in more
Yeah.
detail in future.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Marie Murtagh.
Yeah. It was fun. Thanks, Nish.
Look forward
Always a
to
good time.
look forward to continuing this in the next time.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll line it up. Thank
We
you very
will.
much.
Bye.
Bye.